This is episode 644 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mackenzie Bishop, a returning guest who is one of the co-founders of Abrazo Homes, a home builder and multiple services in that industry provider here in the in the Albuquerque area. Welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Mackenzie.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're going to have a little bit of a unique conversation in the sense that we're going to talk about two very different topics, and we're going to start with one that we really haven't addressed here very much on this show, which is Lobo Athletics and kind of the tie-in, considerable as it may be, to New Mexico's economic situation. But before we get down that particular rabbit hole or subject, as the case may be, why don't you just share briefly about some of your personal interest and involvement in the Lobos athletic teams?
Sure. So, as growing up, a New Mexico native and born and raised here, with our only true professional team, I'll call them professional team, the only show in town being the University of New Mexico and the Lobos. Grew up as a diehard Lobo fan. Attended the University of New Mexico where I got my business degree, and now fast forward to today. I'm a member of the Lobo Club board, as well as also serve on the board for the 505 Collective, which is the name, image, and likeness collective for the University of New Mexico that pays the players for their name, image, and likeness, and has become it's a huge wave in college sports that's ever evolving, and it's a huge part of being able to compete in today's day and age, and also our rise in prominence on the basketball side of late, and then hopefully for football for the years to come, as well as all of the other sports.
Yeah, and you jokingly say professional. Of course, that is a fluid situation, and we could do an entire 45-minute show dealing with college sports and the finances thereof, because that is a rapidly evolving field. But when you were a kid, it was much more true amateur. You paid a player, you wound up getting suspended by the NCAA, and the cases are legion. I guess SMU, way back in the day in the '80s, when they got the death penalty for their college sports teams, would be the most notable example. Now, name, image, and likeness, so the players do get some amount of money and can be paid quite generously for their athletic endeavors. But we're here, and I wanted to talk to you about that subject within this whole show because of what happened just recently with the announcement that four of the Lobos Mountain West compatriots or opponents, let me see, Colorado State, Fresno State, San Diego State, and Boise, all are leaving the conference, and that throws the whole Lobo athletic department into chaos. So I believe that this is a college football driven proposition. Why don't you share a little bit about your thoughts and kind of dig into that a little bit?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's no question that this stage of realignment, as well as the past, I mean, this has been going on for 10, 15
Yeah.
years in earnest. I don't think that this is the last stanza of the play. I do think that college football is driving everything, and the more and more that we see, Cal and Stanford playing in the ACC for all of their sports,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Um, they're as ludicrous as they sound, and for everybody but the football and basketball teams who get to charter on all of their trips, they're flying commercial and flying across town, across the country every single time they need to play a conference game, and that's just not really practical. So I really don't see what we're doing today as being sustainable, but I do think it's a shift that's happening, and I think a part of that shift is it does all come down to money. Most of college football is driven exclusively by revenue, especially from television contracts and from media contracts. And so the Mountain West has been on the short end of that stick for the last couple of years. They have a television contract that's up for renewal here in about 2 years, and I think the drive and the concern about what that would look like and the promise of additional revenue is what has driven all teams to move, especially away from long-term geographic rivalries and things that really matter from a collegiate sports standpoint. It
Mm-hmm.
really is just turning into it's professional, it's business, it's about it's what's going to drive and create the most revenue for the athletic programs. And in many cases, we're making all of these decisions with economic um, ramifications being valued above pretty much everything else. So, yeah, what happened last week was certainly unfortunate. Not all that surprising in the grand scheme of things. I think this has been coming for a while. San Diego State's been trying to get into the Pac-12
Mm-hmm.
for years. Um, and I think with the Pac-12 exodus and Oregon State and Washington State sitting on over $200 million of money in their war chest and the desire to create some disruption in the in college sports, I think that's what they did last week. So certainly the first of many more moves to come. We'll see how the University of New Mexico ends on the other side of it, but I have my conspiracy theories. I probably won't share those today, but we'll speak in fact as much as possible.
Well, so the Pac-12 used to be the Pac-10. It became the Pac-2. Now it's the Pac-6 as it stands immediately right now. And so the Lobos could still get into that conference. But taking a step back on the financial aspect, it's to me, I look at it and maybe your insider knowledge says something differently, but television is critical, but it does help to have big donors, sponsors, businesses, and that's something that New Mexico really doesn't have. Obviously, it helps to be able to fill the stadium. There's college sports teams that the Lobos are out there competing with, including Auburn, as they just played, that are filling up 90, close to 100,000 person stadiums. And now you have this name, image, and likeness where you're paying the players not just a stipend, you're paying them good wages. Essentially, some of them are making more as college athletes than they will in the pros. And that involves, again, businesses and corporations that have money to throw at these athletic departments. So, am I missing anything? Is there anything in addition to that?
No, I mean, I think you encapsulated the overall situation. What I will say is there's a lot more nuance on the back end. Sources of revenue there are many different sources of revenue when you're funding an athletic program. And one of the things I'll say, I mean, it's ironic that we're having this on the Rio Grande Foundation podcast, but what I will say is New Mexico athletics essentially function without any subsidy. Um, they fund themselves with all of their revenue, and honestly, they're one of the few schools that actually sends money to main campus to cover the cost of academic scholarships and basically pays its own way. That is very abnormal in college sports. There's only a handful of programs across the country, and everybody knows who they are. They're usually the top 10 roughly schools in college football
Mm-hmm.
that actually run at a net positive most
Mm-hmm.
years. Most schools count on a pretty significant subsidy from either student fees or straight up from state taxes, from state tax revenue. So the University of New Mexico is definitely operating at a deficit from an operating standpoint and from a funding standpoint to most of the schools in the Mountain West, as well as most of the schools across the country. Um, we just have to decide as a state whether we think college sports, especially in a state state of New Mexico that, save for the Isotopes and the New Mexico United, doesn't have a flagship sports program to represent them other than the Aggies and the Lobos. And do we, as a state and as a population, do we value what that means when New Mexico State's beating Auburn on the road on national television, or the Lobos are in the NCAA tournament, or the Aggies are in the NCAA tournament? These are, in my opinion, they're kind of unbelievable and invaluable opportunities to represent the state, and also in a state where we don't have a great deal to be proud of. We have great weather, and our traffic's not too bad. It's really nice from my perspective as a New Mexico native to be proud of something and to know, that we have national prominence on some stage where, instead of talking about our rankings and education or crime or things like that, that we have something that we can take some pride in. It energizes and at least personally makes me feel like it's all worth it.
So last thing on this particular subject, as I mentioned, this is the Pac-12 is now the Pac-6 with the two teams that were there, Oregon State and Washington State, and then the four additions from the Mountain West. That still leaves room for the Lobos. Theoretically, it leaves room for New Mexico State. It leaves room for a lot of other schools as well throughout the broad Mountain West, or even the Pacific West, or heck, you could have teams from Florida. There's no
Sure.
rules anymore. One of the things that I look at it. So most of the four teams that were plucked by the Mountain West, by the Pac-2, have fairly strong historical football programs. They're certainly in major cities with kind of diversified economies. You can argue Fresno State, it's very similar in many ways to Albuquerque in New Mexico, but they've had a strong football team. Do you see the Lobos being in the mix to get into this new conference? What about UNLV? Of course, Nevada, and Las Vegas in particular, very dynamic area, fast growing. Not so good on the football front, but kind of like the Lobos, but definitely a very fast growing city there in Las Vegas with a lot to offer. Are you optimistic that they'll get into this mix?
Well, in a very brief way, I'll say that the tactic to add four schools, and those four schools in particular, was definitely very strategic. They do need at least two more schools to have eight to qualify for the college football playoff, which is what everybody is really chasing.
Sure.
I do anticipate, for just logistical and practical reasons, that they'll probably add four or six more schools.
Yeah.
I think what they did was pretty genius, actually. They basically chopped the head off the Mountain West and created enough chaos that now it's a bidding war for the last 2 to 6 spots. And I do think it's going to come down to money. I think they took four schools that they thought were valuable enough to give them a full revenue share. I think whoever's next very likely won't have the same revenue share, at least, whether that means those schools are paying their own exit fees, which the first four schools won't be paying, or maybe
That's a fee you have to pay to the conference that you're a part of,
right,
and then
which is $17 million
Yeah.
in the Mountain West. So right now, all those schools are on the hook for $17 million.
right.
The Pac-12, with their $200+ million they're sitting on from all the teams that left their conference, they're going to use that to pay those fees. But I could see a situation where schools that are coming in maybe have to pay their own fee, or are maybe taking a smaller share of revenue, whether that be a permanent, which I wouldn't necessarily advocate as being in the best interest of the state of New Mexico, but maybe if it's a 4 to 5 year phased-in period, gives them time to get their sports programs up to snuff, and potentially could be an opportunity for a state with a, $2 to $3 billion surplus. It seems like almost every year we find a way to spend it. And in many cases, we find a way to spend it on stuff that we can't actually practically spend it on. Might not be the worst place to spend $15-20 million per year for 4 or 5 years for both the University of New Mexico and the New Mexico State Aggies, to help us in this period of transition where I really feel like college is changing, and to not be left out and be on the wrong side of this and cause irreparable harm and damage to our two flagship Division I universities might not be a terrible place to spend some money right now.
Well, they certainly have it. I'm not going to advocate one way or the other, but I will say that the state has the money, and they're certainly not using it for anything highly productive at this point. So we can move on to now. You, of course, operate and manage and co-founded Abrazo Homes, and so we're going to move right into the home building and housing situation, which this is one of those issues that has become a hot button at the national level with the presidential campaign. Kamala Harris certainly pushing a lot of housing policy related stuff at the federal level. The governor and legislation coming through the New Mexico legislature and press releases and talk at the state level. Uh, Give us the 35,000-foot view right now of housing in New Mexico, and to the extent that it's similar or different from housing in other parts of the country. What are the forces at play here as you see it in the housing market?
Well, housing is amazing because it's basically economics 101. It's supply and demand and equilibrium.
Right.
And I would say what's happening in New Mexico is essentially what's happening across the country, maybe with some minute market and state-driven differences. But by and large, we had a very prolonged period of what I'll call subsidized demand with ultra low interest rates coming
Mm-hmm.
out of the COVID pandemic. And what that did is that drove pricing across the board. I don't think that that's, I'm not telling you guys anything new. Um,
But those interest rates have been low prior to the pandemic.
They were, but what happened during the pandemic is it made people question where they lived and why they lived there, and made a lot of people mobile,
Mm-hmm.
made a lot of people want more space, made a lot of people need that extra room in the house. It was a disruptive moment in the housing industry that kind of threw off supply and demand
Mm-hmm.
temporarily. And then when you factor in super low interest rates, a lot of velocity in the market from a monetary perspective. It just created kind of a perfect storm. And now, we're running into an issue where long-term chronic issues that are facing our industry related to supply and regulation and things like that. It's kind of a perfect storm that is creating a situation where in New Mexico we're incredibly short on housing inventory. We're probably operating at a 20 to 30,000 home deficit across the state. Most of that in Albuquerque and the surrounding areas, maybe a little bit in Santa Fe too. And we tend to be making things worse most of the time, not better, because we're always so focused on demand side policies, whether it be economic based jobs, economic development. We have this infatuation with job creation
Mm-hmm.
from an economic development standpoint, but no one ever thinks that those people need a place to live. And if we don't have a housing policy that is aligned with our economic development policy, we're going to continue to price out the people that live in New Mexico and make it where housing is only affordable for folks that are coming from, much more expensive markets like pretty much everywhere else but New Mexico.
So I'm just going to run through a little bit on a blog post that I wrote recently about some forces acting upon the housing market, and when I'm done, you can comment on any or all of them. The eviction moratorium during COVID, uh, increased inflation, which of course hit construction materials significantly. New regulations like the new building codes that the governor's imposed as of the start of this year, that does include EV charger mandates, and especially at the apartment level, but also um, at the individual home level. Land use and zoning, crime, and there being housing that could potentially be used but is not attractive on the market because of too much crime, and then gross receipts taxes, which of course have been around on home building and certain aspects of home building that are not part of other states' policies. So, any or all of those that you want to comment on as part of this whole toxic stew that's related to home building and the home shortage?
So I want to start with the last one first, but give an overarching perspective on this.
All
So
right, so
we
GRT.
we talked about, and before I go into GRT, I just said, housing is basic economics
Mm-hmm.
101. It's supply, demand, and affordability. And so on the supply side, that's really driven mostly by local government,
Mm-hmm.
land use regulations. If we can build a lot and we can bring a lot on that meets the market in terms of density, in terms of target price, we can sell it right now. It's really is. There's not a single finished lot or almost finished lot in the Albuquerque market that's not spoken for or committed to a builder. Everybody, we all need more land. So, the supply side is really mostly controlled by local government. Demand side is, largely driven by federal government in the form of subsidized interest rates. Fannie, Freddie, really help
Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, yeah.
They really help to do that. I know one of the presidential candidates is talking about a $25,000 first-time home buyer tax credit. I think that's crazy. I think all that's going to do is just make things worse, not better. I understand the desire, and it sounds really cool, but it really won't make things better. It'll make things worse.
Sure.
And then, from an affordability standpoint, I think that's where the state comes in most. We have, you mentioned gross receipts tax. This is probably my biggest, when we talk about housing, these targeted programs and these, affordable, programs, they help a little bit, but they're not, unless you have structural change. That's what we need to really move the needle. We need the government can't fix this. We need private investment. We need entrepreneurs. We need developers. We need people out there looking at every single piece of land and trying to find the highest and best use and putting that capital to work and bringing these units to market. And until we fix our structural issues, we're not going to have that in a meaningful way that really eats into that 20 to 30,000 unit housing deficiency, because for the last several years, Albuquerque has barely gotten to 2,000 new units of single family housing, and then maybe 2,000 units of multifamily housing, which is about what we need to be doing to keep pace, not catch up. So, and even then, that's probably a little less than the experts would say. But from a gross receipt standpoint, just for background, in New Mexico, gross receipts taxes are essentially levied on the entire purchase price of a new home. So we pay, depending on the municipality, anywhere from 6.5% to almost 9% of our sales price goes to pay gross receipts taxes, which is by far the highest tax rate on new construction in the country, and it's not close. If you think about neighboring states where there's more of a traditional sales tax, they're paying that on material only, not on labor. I like to use the car business as an example. So in New Mexico, we pay an excise tax. It was 3% for a long time on car purchases. Now it's 4%. But that tax is levied on both new car purchases and anytime a used car changes hands. Anytime title changes, you're paying an excise tax on that value or that purchase price. In the home industry and real estate, that is only paid when you build it. If you're selling your house, imagine the riots in the street. If people had to pay 8% gross receipts tax on the sale of their personal residence, people would lose their minds. But essentially what we're doing is all of that tax is being levied on new homes, which we need more new homes. We need more supply to solve this problem. And yet we have a disproportionate tax structure on new construction that no one else pays. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that that's, you get what you ask for, and that's what we have right now.
Well, you're in the right place to talk about the horrors of the gross receipts tax. So this is a safe space in that regard. But let's talk about land use and crime and those kinds of things, because first and foremost, we do know here in Albuquerque, at least, that land is at a bit of a premium. I mean, you have the Southwest Mesa to an extent. You have some availability in that general area. Then you have the Mesa del Sol area. But I also look at the crime situation and say there's a lot of younger people who would love to, I think, live downtown in apartments and some of these places along Central. But and I know that the mayors and city council have recently put some tax subsidies behind some places that they're trying to redevelop. But until the public safety issue is addressed, you're not going to have a lot of that infill development in some of those areas. It's just not attractive.
100%. I mean,
Okay.
in a landlocked city, and it's crazy to think about in the fifth largest state in the union, with the population we have, that land is a premium. But it is, if you think about our geographic and political boundaries that are all around Albuquerque, we're in a box, and the box is filling in. And just the other day I was driving, down Central between Tramway and Wantabo, and there's so many buildings that are just boarded up and have been that way for 10 to 15, if not 20 years. And when we think about available land that's served by infrastructure, that is ready to go, and we often think about, my business partner and I always say, it's like, if you gave us the land for free, would we build something? And if in a situation like that, I probably wouldn't, because by the time you deal with crime, by the time you deal with ultimately appraisal issues, which limit your ability to pass along true cost, and you deal with theft and vandalism and ultimately just marketability, there's just certain parts of town that, because of crime, have become, they've become housing deserts.
Yeah.
And it's really unfortunate, because there's redevelopment success stories across the country. We haven't quite figured out what that is, but and how to tap into that. But I really do believe it starts with, we need to clean up our act, and we need to address crime in a meaningful way. Because without that, then our most popular communities are in Rio Rancho and Los Lunas, because schools are schools are pretty good. Public safety's there. You call the police, they're there within 5 minutes or less. That kind of stuff matters when people are thinking about where to buy a home.
Just to be clear, you're talking about your company's most popular areas are Rio Rancho.
Rio Rancho and Los Lunas. And most people don't know this, but the Rio Rancho is a town of 100,000 people or something like that. Has out-permitted Albuquerque on a single-family basis for probably 7 out of the last 10 years.
Yeah, and they have their infrastructure challenges, as well as the land kind of acquisition issues that come from the land scam gone right, that is Rio Rancho. But let's talk about the high-rise building. Formerly, it was Bank of the West, at least in the lobby there at San Mateo and Central. I mean, that's a enormous property. I don't know whoever thought it would be a great idea to build a high rise like that at Central and San Mateo. But I mean, you're talking about an area that's not too far from what has historically been a very popular area, the Nob Hill area of our city. It's struggling right now, but Nob Hill remains an attractive area, and it's just the attractiveness of that particular property. But I don't know how many how many units are there in there? It's hundreds, right?
Yeah, I want to say that the redevelopment plans on that are 200-ish units in that building. Again, I mean, I looked at the offering for that, and they got it for an amazing price, but it still comes down to, I don't know if it'll be successful. I really don't.
Oh, I don't think there's a crystal ball powerful enough to figure that one out.
I wouldn't have gambled my money on it. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Well, it's not in a bad location from a lot of perspectives, except for the very serious crime issue.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked about Rio Rancho versus Albuquerque. If you could choose, would you rather live 10 minutes from uptown and have an awesome house and or a townhome with a nice yard and you can place for your dog, or would you rather sit in traffic for 45 minutes to 50 minutes every day to get home from work? I mean, it doesn't take rocket science. The biggest missing thing is public safety and important, but to a lesser extent, education.
Yeah, because Rio Rancho, they have no interstates anywhere really near Rio Rancho.
It's terrible.
Yeah. So I guess any of the other issues that we talked about, obviously inflation, is that kind of coming under control? And obviously the listeners of this show understand that when we're talking about inflation dropping or slowing, we're not talking about prices dropping, or maybe they are in this particular industry, but we're talking about the rate of increase in inflation slowing down. So where are construction materials and overall kind of pricing going in the housing market?
So we've really enjoyed a pretty stable period of costs for the last 18 months, after probably the most tumultuous 3 to 4 years that we'd had in a long time. So on the vertical side, costs are pretty stable. Lumber's been nice, commodity driven stuff. I mean, it's increasing with inflation, but it's not it's not unstable or unsustainable. Where we do see still continued cost escalation that's going to drive the next wave of price escalation is in horizontal improvements. Used to be we could buy a piece of land and be into the land for maybe $10,000-$15,000 a lot, and the development of those lots would cost $25,000-$30,000, and you could put a house that was $250,000 on that lot. Today, you can't develop a lot for less than $75,000.
By horizontal, you're talking physical land.
Dirt, moving dirt,
Okay.
concrete, asphalt, utilities, literally just getting everything, a subdivision ready to put a house on it.
Now, how much of that is driven by government policy versus, or to be completely open, the land use and the land cost versus the costs associated with actually moving the dirt and the utilities, et cetera.
The land dirt basis used to be one of the biggest parts of a lot cost. Today, it's more about the cost of moving dirt. There's a lot of causes to that. I do think just in general, one of the things that we're going to struggle with in our industry, but also across the country, it's really hard to be small. You have to be big. With regulation, with sick leave, with all the different risks. But in addition, it's just really hard to start a company now. So you have much fewer entrepreneurs starting companies. I mean, there's a lot of data at the IRS about the number of active EINs is plummeted. From
employee or identification numbers.
Yeah, so the actual number of active businesses has plummeted since the mid 90s, because it's just really hard to be small. It's hard to compete. And so how that affects our business is there's fewer players doing the work, but they're bigger. And so there's not near as much price competition. There's not near as much downward pressure on efficiency. And there's not near as much competition. And so we're facing that on the horizontal improvement side, but we're also seeing it on the vertical side. I mean, the number of vendors that we have doing almost everybody's work in town is a little bit staggering, a little crazy, and it's a big risk factor for our industry going forward. So the challenge of being small in this environment and as a building company, I mean, we're to the point now where it's like, how do we scale to cover the cost of all the overhead we have to carry in order to be compliant, and you either have to be tiny or you got to get big. I mean, it's really hard to be a small or medium-sized business.
How about finding workers? Is that more of a problem still than it was pre-pandemic, or are we kind of back to middle of the road?
It's better today, but that's largely because apartment construction is waning rather dramatically with the interest rate environment. As your interest rates come down, we're going to have another challenge. And the hard part is there's fewer people in the trades, and a lot of people will talk about that. We need new young people in the trades because they can make great money. I mean, a journeyman electrician makes $100,000 a year. So they're great jobs. We need more people in the trades, but we also need to stop making it worse by, when we give a $30 billion industrial revenue bond to Facebook, and Facebook creates 100 or 150 permanent jobs, but there's no gross receipts tax being paid. They're a huge water user, and they created a huge drain on electrical journeymen that we've struggled with. So our electrical costs have more than doubled in the last 5 years because journeyman electricians can just go make more money at Facebook. And so things like that, we just have to think about the ripple effects of what we do. Is this really what's in the best interest of the state when we're giving away all this money and driving up housing costs?
Obviously, Rio Grande Foundation talks a lot about workforce participation rates and the attractiveness of the hammock versus getting out and doing work. And these are jobs that a high school diploma is perfectly fine to get into some of these entry-level positions, right?
Yeah, I mean, high school diploma is great for getting in the entry-level positions, but it's also all you need to be, a foreman or a team lead on a framing crew. That, those guys, if you know what you're doing on a framing crew and you're busy every day, you could make $125,000-$150,000 a year, no problem. And there's just not a lot of jobs out there that pay that.
Yeah,
but it is hard work. So,
do you find it's mostly still guys, or are there young women getting into any of these construction jobs at a greater level?
It's interesting. I think there's definitely, I don't have a data point, but anecdotally, yeah, there's a lot more women working on our houses than there used to be, for sure.
Let's talk about the building codes quickly. those became in place, or were put in place by the Construction Industries Division at the beginning of the year. We were part of that process. We opposed the EV mandates, especially on the apartments, but there were significant additions to the code for home builders as well. The EV component maybe not as big as for apartments, but definitely things related to insulation and attic size and that kind of stuff. What are we? I believe the Republican House members wrote an op-ed saying it was going to increase the price of an average home something like $75,000. That seems a little aggressive, but where do you see those building codes, and how much are they really going to inflate the cost of housing?
Yeah, these $75,000 estimates are they're when people exaggerate like that, they lose credibility. For us to have like a meaningful debate about these issues, the new energy code that just was adopted earlier this year and just went into effect on July 29th or something like that. It's going to drive up cost for sure. Not 75,000, not 750, but to the end consumer, it'll probably add $4,000 to $5,000 of cost. Maybe 8 to 10, depending on what the builder was doing before. For us, it's more of a logistical challenge than anything. The EV mandates beyond the cost, the EV pre-wire charging that we have to do in every house, which is to the consumer going to add $750 to $1,000 of cost.
Okay.
The challenge that we deal with is all these houses that we're building homes in were designed by P&M 4 to 5 years ago and don't have the capacity for the load that we're adding to the grid. So the unintended consequences associated with rolling this out retroactively, it's going to be interesting. And I would say, P&M is probably one of, if not the hardest group we deal with right now.
Really?
They're not very well run. It's essentially like dealing with another arm of government, to be honest with you. And so, and there's no coordination between what's going on at the state and at P&M. There's no foresight. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it goes logistically. All that's going to fall on us to figure out.
So how does that work? You're talking about prior home designs and plans that you then have to go in and retrofit the whole design to accommodate the new building code.
Yeah, so when we engineer a subdivision, we plan for a certain amount of loading. So one of the things
electrical grid.
Yeah, the electrical grid. One of the things that happened 10, 15 years ago was, as an energy code thing, evaporative coolers were banned. And that was to save water. It was to, improve the overall efficiency and sealing of the house. But it also drove up electrical demand because refrigerated air is is a much bigger need. So there are issues where there's not enough transformer capacity. And when you add these things that, every pre-wire is a 50 amp breaker. So if someone's using that, and if we start using that in mass, we're going to exceed the transformer capacity in these communities, which is going to require additional transformers, which are really hard to get, by the way. That is one of the things that we still have supply chain issues. It has to do with switch gears and transformers, which are electrical backbone type things that we have to put in the subdivisions for the homes to have power. So those are the kind of the unintended consequences that are going to be really interesting, because there was a story, so everybody wants solar, right? When
you're subsidizing it like they are, it makes sense to
when you're giving money away and driving people to do that and encouraging them to do that and giving them subsidized low interest rate financing on it. But what happens is you exceed grid capacity on that. So there's a story in Northwest Albuquerque where there was a community where they literally were declining people's applications for solar because the grid could not take any more backfeed of power. And so things like that, where it's just we're incentivizing this, but we're not planning for it on the infrastructure side. It just creates unintended consequences. And it's, we watch it and kind of chuckle, but at the end of the day, it's avoidable, which is, the really disappointing and frustrating part.
All right. Well, we are about at the end of our time together. So I'll give you the chance to kind of give any last thoughts or anything that we missed in this conversation, certainly about home building, but if there's something Lobo athletic related you want to toss in here at the last second, I defer to you. So either way, take it away.
No, I think just in general, it's an amazing time to be in our industry. It's very dynamic. It's challenging, which we appreciate. That it's not for the faint of heart, and it's a barrier to entry. So, from a competitive standpoint, we love that. And I'll just say it's great that housing is finally getting the airtime and the attention that it's really needed for a long time. We'll see if we can come up with some really good solutions. The conversation started. That's the first point. So.
Well, since I've got just a second, I'll ask you. So you seem to be bearish on what Kamala Harris is doing, although her plans to create all this new housing are very ill-defined. We don't know exactly what she means, and that's part of the entire problem with Kamala Harris's agenda. But on the governor's side, we've got 2 more years with this governor. Do you think she and the legislature are, broadly speaking, moving in the right direction with their housing policies? Or are we still kind of caught in the same general approach that hasn't worked very well?
Well, what I'll give the governor some credit. She did appoint Daniel Werwath as her cabinet director of housing. I don't know his official title. And I will say he's great. He knows what he's talking about. He's listening. I do think that they're trying to embrace market-based approaches and market housing. The challenge is the state can only do so much of that. It really comes down to local government buying in and getting aligned. And so, the state can move the needle when it comes to affordability. We could do some temporary GRT relief on the state side. We could create some hooks or some use the stick that affects local government's ability to collect fees, which is allowed by state statute. There's some things that the state government can do. The challenge that we always have is there enough alignment? Is there enough? Can we get enough cooperation between the governor and the different houses of the legislature that, though they are all controlled by Democrats, they haven't necessarily been getting along all that well of late. And so, can we get any of this really difficult stuff and hard stuff passed is going to be a question, especially going into the long session after the election.
Yeah. Well, of course, GRT reform on a permanent basis would be ideal.
It would be amazing.
Well, Rob Black, if you're listening, good luck, buddy. This is your thing. So
give Jason Harper a call. He's done a lot of work on it.
Yeah. Of course, Rob is the newly minted Economic Development Secretary. Well, we'll have to leave it there, Mackenzie. If people want to contact you about one of your wonderful homes or anything else, I guess maybe Lobo alumni, how do people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I guess the best place to get a hold of me is on Twitter or X if you wanted to talk with me directly. It's at Abrazo Mac, M-A-C-K. But if you're interested in a home, which we would love to sell you one and build you one, and have you join the Abrazo family, you can just go to our website at abrazohomes.com and ask Blair, reach out to her. She's awesome. She'll take care of you. She's our matchmaker. So
fantastic. All right. Well, thank you. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.